grabbed her by the wrist so hard she stumbled off the wooden platform and into the mud, and he laughed. The crowd laughed with him. A girl, maybe 20, soaked through her dress, unable to cry out, unable to beg, unable to do anything except stare at the ground while men placed bids on her life like she was a mule at market. Her stepmother stood at the edge of the crowd, counting the coins already promised to her. Not once did she look at the girl's face. If that had been your daughter standing in the rain, what would you have done? If you've ever felt invisible, discarded, or sold short by the very people who were supposed to protect you, this story is going to stay with you for a long time. Before we go any further, if you're new here, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Blackthorn Crossing, because what happened next changed everything. The rain had been falling since before dawn. Not the gentle kind that softens the earth and smells like something clean. This was the kind of rain that had no patience, that came sideways off the ridge and turned the main street of Blackthorn, crossing into something between a river and a wound. The kind of rain that made a person feel like the sky itself had given up on them. Mara Vane stood on a wooden platform outside Digger's general store and felt the cold work its way through the soles of her boots, up through the thin cotton of her dress, and into the bones of her hands. She kept her hands folded in front of her. She kept her eyes down. Both of these things she had learned to do a long time ago. Above her, nailed to the post, was a piece of paper with words written in her stepmother's hand. She had not been allowed to read it. She could guess what it said. Deaf-mute, female, age 20, strong, obedient, capable of domestic work. Starting bid, $4. Her stepmother, Gertrude Hollis, stood just behind her close enough that Mara could feel the woman's presence the way you feel a cold draft under a door. Gertrude was not a large woman. She had a narrow face and small, careful eyes, and the particular kind of stillness that belongs to people who have already made their decision and see no reason to revisit it. She smelled like camphor oil and something else Mara had never been able to name. She had smelled that way for as long as Mara could remember. "Stand up straight," Gertrude said quietly, not loudly. She never did anything loudly when it mattered. Mara straightened. The crowd that had gathered was small by any generous accounting, maybe 15 men, maybe 20, if you counted the ones lurking at the edges, pretending they hadn't come for this. Miners, mostly. Men who had come down from the diggings with enough coin in their pockets to feel dangerous. 2 or 3 of them were already drunk despite the hour. One man near the front had mud caked into his beard and kept shifting his weight from foot to foot like a dog waiting to be let off a leash. "What's wrong with her?" someone called out, a voice Mara didn't recognize. Gertrude answered smoothly, the way she always answered things. "Nothing is wrong with her. She was born without hearing or voice. But her hands work fine, her back is strong, and she won't give you any trouble." That last part ought to be worth something. There was laughter at that. "Not the warm kind. $4, the muddy-bearded man said immediately, before the first word was even finished settling in the air. $4.50, someone else said from further back. $5. Mara stared at the wood planks beneath her feet. There was a knot in one of them shaped almost like a closed eye. She fixed her gaze on it. She had learned to do this, to find one small thing to look at and hold on to it, while everything around her became something she simply waded through. It was not courage. It was not even dignity. It was simply the thing her mind did when there was nothing else left to do. She heard everything. She always had. The bidding climbed slowly, the way these things do when nobody is in a real hurry, and everyone wants to see if someone else will flinch first. $6. $7. The drunk near the front dropped out at $7.50 with a sound of disgust. The muddy-bearded man whose name she would later learn was Cutter Foss climbed steadily. Foss worked for one of the logging camps in the valley. He was known in the way that men who do particular kinds of harm become known, by the women who warned each other about him in quiet voices. Mara knew his name. She had heard women say it in those voices. At $9, only Foss and one other man remained. The other man, older, wearing a decent coat, hesitated at $9.50. You could almost hear him thinking, almost hear him calculating whether a deaf girl was worth the difference between a comfortable winter and a lean one. He stepped back. Foss grinned, and then he stepped up onto the platform. He didn't wait for Gertrude to hand Mara down. He grabbed her by the wrist. That was the moment that had made the crowd laugh, that stumble into the mud, that helpless pitch forward, and he laughed with his whole chest like this was the best thing that had happened to him all week. Mara caught herself on her hands and knees in the freezing mud and looked up, and there was his face, red and wet with rain, grinning down at her from the platform edge. "Come on then," he said. "Up you get." She had not moved. Not because she couldn't, because something in her, something older than thought, had simply gone very still. And that was when she heard the new voice, let go of her. It came from across the street. The voice was not loud. That was the first strange thing about it. Most men who wanted to be heard in a crowd made themselves loud. This one didn't. It was the kind of voice that comes from somewhere low in the chest, the kind that carries not because of volume, but because of weight. Like something that had been compressed for a long time and had finally decided to speak. Mara looked up through the rain. He was standing on the opposite boardwalk, one shoulder against a support post. A big man, not just tall but wide, the kind of wide that comes from years of physical work rather than any particular intention. He wore a heavy canvas coat with the collar up and a hat that had been through enough weather to stop caring what it looked like. He had a beard that was more gray than brown, and the kind of face that doesn't give away much but had clearly been given a great deal to carry. He was looking at Foss. Foss turned. The grin didn't disappear exactly. It just rearranged itself into something more careful. "This ain't your business, Cade." So they knew each other. Or knew of each other. The way men in small towns know of each other without ever being friends. $10, the man called Cade said. He was still leaning against the post. He hadn't raised his voice. Gertrude made a sound. Somewhere between surprise and recalculation, Foss let go of Mara's wrist. She hadn't noticed until that moment how tightly he had been holding it. 12, Foss said, still grinning, but differently now. 15. The crowd had gone quiet. Rain hammered the wooden awnings. Somewhere down the street, a horse stamped in the mud. Foss stared across the street for a long moment. His jaw worked. $20, he said, loudly enough that everyone could hear it, because he wanted everyone to hear that he was not backing down. The man called Cade straightened up from the post. He reached inside his coat. He produced something, a small leather pouch, and he weighed it once in his palm, the way a man does when he already knows what's in it and has already decided. 25, he said. The silence that followed lasted maybe 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, Foss understood something, not that he'd lost the bidding, but something more specific about the kind of man standing across the street and what it would mean to push further. He stepped off the platform. He didn't say anything as he left. He didn't have to. Mara was still kneeling in the mud. The man called Cade crossed the street. She didn't look up at him right away, old habit, that, keeping her eyes down, but she tracked his approach by the sound of his boots on the wet boards and then the soft suction of each step in the mud. He stopped in front of her. He didn't crouch down. He didn't offer his hand immediately. "Can you stand?" he said. She didn't answer. She wasn't supposed to answer. He crouched then, and she made herself look at his face because she needed to know what she was dealing with. She'd learned to read faces the way some people read books quickly, looking for the thing underneath the thing. His face was tired. Not the short-term tiredness of a man who'd had a bad night, but something that had been living behind his eyes for years. There were lines around his mouth that came from weather and not from smiling. His eyes were a kind of gray-green that she didn't have a word for. They were looking at her with an expression she did not immediately recognize because she had not seen it very often. Not pity, not desire, not calculation, something more like anger. But not at her, at the situation, at the platform, at the laughing crowd that had already mostly dispersed. At Gertrude, who was now completing her transaction with a young man who'd come to collect the money, not once looking in Mara's direction. Cade reached out and offered his hand. Mara took it, and he pulled her upright, and he did not let go immediately, not from any inappropriate reason, but because she was clearly unsteady, and the mud beneath her boots was uncertain. "I'm Ronan Cade," he said. "I live up in the high country." "About 2 days' ride from here," he paused. "Nobody's going to hurt you." She looked at him. He seemed to realize mid-sentence that she couldn't hear him. That's what he believed, and she watched him adjust, watched him try to figure out how to communicate the thing he'd just said without words. He settled for pointing to her, then to himself, then making a gesture that she interpreted as "we're going now, together." She nodded. He went to collect his horse and the pack animal he'd brought down from the mountain. She stood in the rain and waited, and while she waited, she let herself hear the last of what was happening around her. 2 men near the store's awning were talking about Cade. About how he'd been coming down from the high country once a season for 11 years. About how he'd come back from some war before that and never quite come all the way back, if you understood the distinction. About how he kept to himself and had money because he was good at what he did and spent almost none of it. "What's he want with a deaf girl?" one of them said. "Damned if I know," the other one said. "Man that age, alone that long, could be anything." Mara stored this information the way she stored all information. Quietly, without reaction, Cade came back with the horses. He helped her onto the pack animal, a stocky gray gelding that smelled like pine resin and old sweat, and he did it with a particular kind of careful that she recognized as someone who had helped injured things before. Not people necessarily, animals, but the instinct was the same. They rode out of Blackthorn Crossing in the rain. Neither of them spoke. He didn't try to. She watched his back as he rode ahead of her and tried to understand what she had just walked into. She had been in bad situations before. She had learned to assess them. She thought about Foss and what that would have been, and then she thought about this, a silent man on a gray mountain horse, and made the only calculation available to her. This was better. Whether it was good was a different question entirely. They were an hour out of town when the rain intensified to the point where she could feel it working through the coat. Gertrude had given her the thin one, the cast-off, and into her skin. She hadn't said anything. She wasn't supposed to say anything. But Cade must have noticed, because he pulled his horse to a stop and turned. He looked at her for a moment. Then he shrugged off his own coat, a heavy thing, oilskin over wool, the kind that had been broken in over many winters, and rode back to her and held it out. She stared at it. He made a small gesture. "Take it." She took it. It was warm from his body and smelled like wood smoke, and something sharp and clean, probably the mountain air itself, embedded in the fibers over years of living in it. She pulled it around herself, and the warmth was so abrupt and so complete after the cold that she had to look away from him, because something in her chest did something she wasn't prepared for. He rode forward again. He was wearing just a heavy wool shirt now, and the rain soaked it within minutes, but he gave no sign that this bothered him. They rode for another hour. The trail climbed into the trees, and the rain thinned a little under the canopy, though the cold didn't. At some point, she wasn't sure when he slowed until the horses were side by side, and then he said something she wasn't expecting. He wasn't looking at her when he said it. He was looking at the trail ahead, at the dark water running down the wheel ruts, at the place where the pines crowded the sky. "I know you can't hear me," he said, "but I'm going to say it anyway, because it needs saying." She kept her face neutral. She was very good at this. "Nobody's going to hurt you up here," he said. "I live alone. You'll have your own space, and I won't. I'm not going to bother you." "That's not what this is." He paused. The horse's hooves found their rhythm in the mud. "I should have stepped in sooner," he said, and his voice changed on those words, went lower, went rougher, like something scraping on stone. "I heard about the auction 3 days ago and told myself it wasn't my problem. Spent 3 days telling myself that." Another pause. "I was wrong about that." She listened to the rain and the horses and the sound of his breathing, and she thought about the 3 days he had spent arguing with himself. about whether a girl on an auction block in a town he barely visited was his problem or not, about what it cost him to finally cross that street. She thought about what it must be like to spend 11 years alone in the mountains and still feel the pull of someone else's suffering from 3 days away. She didn't look at him, but she pulled his coat a little tighter around herself and she thought, this is going to be complicated. The trail ahead disappeared into the dark throat of the mountain pass, and the horses climbed toward it without being asked, because they'd made this trip before and they knew the way home. Mara Vane, who was not deaf, who had not been deaf for 7 years, who had built her entire survival around a silence that was never real, rode into the mountains behind a man who had just paid $25 for her freedom without expecting anything in return. And she heard every word he said, every single word. This story is a work of fiction created entirely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, and events are fictional. The cabin appeared through the trees just before dark on the second day, and it was nothing like what Mara had imagined. She wasn't sure what she had imagined exactly. Something rougher, maybe. Something that matched the bleakness of the auction platform and the cold ride up the mountain. But the cabin sat in a shallow clearing between 2 enormous pines, and it had the look of something that had been built carefully and maintained even more carefully over many years. The logs were tight, the roof was solid. There was a woodpile stacked against the east wall that was taller than she was, and twice as wide, split and layered with the kind of obsessive precision that told you the man who built it had strong opinions about being cold. Ronan dismounted without ceremony and began leading both horses toward the small barn at the edge of the clearing. He glanced back at her once, that checking glance, the one she was already starting to recognize, and then continued. He didn't help her down this time. She wondered if he'd decided she didn't need it, or if he simply trusted her to manage. She managed. Her legs were stiff from 2 days in the saddle, and one of her boots caught on the stirrup, and she grabbed the gelding's mane to keep from pitching sideways, but she got down. The gelding was patient about it. Inside the cabin, the air smelled like old wood smoke and pine pitch, and something else she couldn't immediately name, a kind of mineral cold that had lived in the walls through many winters. There was one main room with a stone fireplace that took up most of the north wall, a table, 2 chairs that didn't match, a narrow cot pushed against the far wall, and a ladder going up to a loft. A single oil lamp on the table, a shelf of practical things, tools, rope, dried herbs, and paper packets. One small mirror hung at an angle that suggested it had been placed by feel rather than by vanity. She stood in the middle of the room and turned slowly, taking inventory the way she always did in new places. Looking for exits, looking for things that could be used as weapons. Looking for the small signs that told you who a person really was when no one was watching. The shelf of herbs was more extensive than she would have expected. Someone had labeled each packet in cramped handwriting: yarrow, willow bark, boneset, valerian. Either he got sick out here often and had learned to deal with it himself, or he'd had someone teach him, or he'd simply read about it and decided knowledge was cheaper than a doctor a 2-day ride away. Any of those 3 said something different about him. There were no personal items visible except one thing, a small folded paper tucked into the frame of the mirror. She didn't go look at it. Not yet. Ronan came in from the barn 20 minutes later, stamping mud off his boots at the door. He stopped when he saw her still standing in the middle of the room, and something crossed his face, not irritation exactly. More like the particular discomfort of a man suddenly aware that his private space had a person in it and he hadn't quite planned for what that meant in practical terms. Right, he said, mostly to himself. He pulled off his hat and hung it on the peg by the door. His hair was gray at the temples and badly flattened from the hat, and he pushed a hand through it without seeming to care how it looked. The loft is mine. You take the cot. He pointed to be sure she understood. It's warmer down here near the fire anyway. He crossed to the fireplace and began building a fire with the efficient movements of someone who has done this so many times it had moved past habit into something more like breathing. She watched him. He didn't perform it. Didn't check to see if she was watching, didn't do it with any particular care for how it looked. He just built the fire because it needed building. When the kindling caught, he straightened and turned and found her still watching him. And for just a moment, something awkward hung in the air between them, the specific awkwardness of two strangers suddenly alone together in a small space with no established rules. "There's dried venison on the top shelf," he said, pointing again. "And cornmeal. I'll cook tonight. You don't have to. I mean, I'm not expecting." He stopped. "Tried again. This isn't that kind of arrangement." He seemed frustrated with himself for not being able to communicate clearly to someone he believed couldn't hear him. He crossed to the table and pulled out one of the mismatched chairs and set it near the fireplace, the closer one, the one that would warm fastest, and pointed to it. She sat. He cooked. It wasn't elegant. He boiled the cornmeal in an iron pot with strips of dried venison and a handful of something dried from one of the herb packets, and the result was plain to the point of severity, but it was hot. And she ate everything he put in front of her, which she could tell surprised him slightly. He ate standing at the counter with his back half turned, which she thought was his way of giving her the illusion of privacy. That night he climbed to the loft without a word. She lay on the cot in the firelight and listened to the sound of him moving around up there, the creak of floorboards, the rustle of blankets, and then silence. She lay on her back and stared at the ceiling and listened to the mountain breathe around the cabin. Wind in the pines, something moving in the distance. The fire settling into coals. She did not sleep for a long time. She was thinking about what he had said on the trail. "I heard about the auction 3 days ago and told myself it wasn't my problem. Spent 3 days telling myself that." She turned that over and over in her mind, the way you turn a stone over to see what lives underneath. 3 days. He had known about her for 3 days. He had ridden down from this mountain 2 days down, which meant he'd left before he'd even fully decided, and when he got there, he had still stood across the street for some amount of time before he crossed it. She wanted to know what had finally made him cross. She suspected she already did, but she wanted to be wrong, because if she was right, it meant something about him that was going to make everything harder. She suspected it was the moment Foss grabbed her wrist. Not the auction itself, not the rain or the platform or the bidding. The grab, the laugh, the particular way Foss had reached up and taken hold of her like she was a piece of equipment that had fallen off a shelf. That was when Ronan Cade had pushed off the wall. Some men could watch an auction and not feel anything they couldn't manage. Very few of them could watch that laugh. She pulled his coat, she still had it. He hadn't asked for it back around herself more tightly, and stared at the ceiling, and thought about how strange it was to be afraid of the wrong things. The first week passed the way first weeks pass, when two people don't know each other and are too careful to make a sound. Ronan left early each morning with his traps and his rifle and came back before dark, usually with something: a rabbit, once a small deer, twice nothing at all, which seemed to bother him more than she thought it should. She spent the days learning the cabin the way you learn a language, slowly, by immersion, by touching things and watching what happened. She found the water source, a spring 20 yards behind the cabin, covered with a flat stone to keep leaves out. She found where he kept his extra lamp oil and his ammunition, and his small store of actual medicine, which was meager, and told her he mostly relied on the herbs. She found the one book he owned, which was a trail guide to the mountain range, with hand-drawn annotations in the margins in his cramped writing. She started cooking, not grandly. She wasn't trying to impress him. She simply discovered that the dried beans needed soaking before he got back if they were going to be edible, and that the cornmeal improved significantly with a little of the rendered fat from the game he brought in, and that the yarrow he had dried was better made as a tea than left in a pot of stew where it turned bitter. These were small things, practical things. But when he came in the third evening to find the beans already cooked and seasoned with salt, and a strip of venison crisped in the pan, and the tea already steeping, he stopped in the doorway and looked at the table, and then looked at her. And the expression on his face was one she hadn't seen on him yet. He looked briefly, like a man who had forgotten something could feel good. You didn't have to do that, he said. She was already sitting at the table waiting, her face arranged into its neutral configuration, and she gave the small shrug she'd developed for responses that needed to communicate. It was nothing without using words. He sat across from her and ate, and this time he ate at the table instead of standing at the counter, and it was a small thing, but it wasn't nothing. On the 5th day, he brought her a pair of proper wool socks from a chest in the loft, because her feet in those thin boots were clearly suffering. She'd caught him looking at her feet during the ride up, assessing the way he probably assessed the condition of his horse's hooves. On the 7th day, she found a second blanket on the cot when she woke up, folded neatly at the foot, no explanation offered or expected. He was not a man who explained himself, but she was learning, a man who noticed things and then quietly did something about them. This was dangerous information. The snow came in the 2nd week, and it came hard. Not the first snow of the season. There had been a light dusting before they arrived that still sat in the shadows of the north-facing slopes, but the real snow, the first of the serious winter, it came down for 3 days without stopping and changed the character of everything. The mountain went quiet in a way that was different from silence. It was absorption. The snow took all the sound and held it. On the 2nd day of heavy snow, Ronan couldn't run his trap lines. He spent the morning repairing harness leather at the table, and Mara sat across from him mending a tear in one of his shirts that had been sitting in a pile waiting for attention. She'd simply picked it up and started on it without asking, and he'd watched her for a moment and then gone back to the leather without comment. They worked in silence for an hour, a comfortable silence which surprised her, because silences usually weren't comfortable when she was the reason for them. Then he said, not looking up from the harness, "I had a dog." Before named her Birch because of her markings. He paused. "She died 3 winters ago. I keep thinking I hear her sometimes. Mornings especially." He glanced up, remembered she couldn't hear him. Looked back down. Mara kept her eyes on the mending, and her face arranged appropriately and held everything she was feeling very still inside herself. He had said it anyway, even knowing she couldn't hear. He had said it because 3 winters was a long time to keep something to yourself, and sometimes you just needed to put the words in the air regardless of whether anyone received them. She understood this better than he could possibly have known. Over the following weeks it became a pattern. He would work or sit by the fire in the evenings, and he would talk. Not every evening, not in any predictable rhythm. But sometimes, with his eyes on the middle distance or on his hands or on the fire, he would simply begin speaking. About small things at first, the trail conditions. A particular stretch of creek where the beaver had been working. The quality of this winter's snowpack compared to others he had known. And then, gradually, the larger things. He talked about the war. Not in detail, he never gave her names or battles, never described anything specific, but in the way that people talk around trauma when they can't talk through it. He talked about the noise of it and how the silence afterward had felt like a different kind of violence. He talked about coming back to a town that had moved on while he'd been somewhere he couldn't describe to people who hadn't been there, and how he'd spent 3 years trying to be the person they expected before he'd finally understood he couldn't be that person anymore. "Came up here the winter I turned 30, he said one night, watching the fire. Told myself it was temporary. 11 years is a long temporary, I suppose." He said this with something in his voice that was not quite bitterness and not quite acceptance. Somewhere in between, the place where people live when they have made peace with a decision, but not completely. Mara was washing the tin plates at the basin, her back to him, and she closed her eyes for just a moment. She was thinking about temporary arrangements that become permanent. She was thinking about a silence she had put on 7 years ago to survive a single season that had then lasted and lasted and lasted. She was also thinking, with a clarity that frightened her slightly, that she had not once thought about leaving. In the town below, in any version of her life that did not include this cabin on this mountain, she had always been aware of exits. Always cataloging them, always knowing where the door was and how fast she could reach it. It was not something she did consciously. It was simply how her mind had arranged itself after years of needing to know. Up here, she had stopped doing it. She wasn't sure when. The days found their shape. Ronan in the mornings with his traps and his rifle. Mara maintaining the cabin, the fire, the food stores, the small endless maintenance of a life lived in a harsh place. In the evenings, the fire and the silence that wasn't quite silence anymore that had become, somehow, conversation of a different kind. The way he passed her the mug before she had to ask for it. The way she had the fire built back up before he came through the door, so the warmth hit him immediately. These small anticipations that accumulated over weeks into something neither of them had named. One evening, in what she judged to be the 6th week, he came back from the trap line with a bad cut on his left hand. He'd dressed it himself, badly a strip of cloth tied too loosely, already reddening at the edges in a way she didn't like. He showed it to her because it needed cleaning, and he clearly couldn't manage it one-handed. And she cleaned it at the table by lamplight, with water she'd already boiled and a poultice of the yarrow paste she'd learned to make from his notes in the margins of the trail guide. He sat very still while she worked. She was aware of his eyes on her face, which was something she usually avoided, but couldn't this time without dropping the work. "You're good at this," he said. She didn't respond. Obviously, but she felt the words land somewhere in her chest and stay there. "Did someone teach you?" he said. Then, immediately, the self-correction, the small, frustrated sound he made when he forgot. The reminder to himself. She focused on the bandage. She tied it correctly, firmly, but not cutting off circulation, and she pressed the back of his hand once briefly, just a quick press. 2 fingers, gone immediately, to indicate it was done. She wasn't sure why she did that. She hadn't planned it. He looked at his hand, then at her. "Thank you," he said. Quietly, like he meant it as more than the surface thing. She nodded and took the basin away to empty it. And when her back was to him, she let herself breathe for a moment, because that small, pressed thank you had done something to the architecture of her internal defenses, and she needed a moment to assess the damage. The thing about Ronan Cade was that he wasn't performing goodness. That was the problem. She knew what performed goodness looked like, had seen it from people who wanted something, who needed you compliant and grateful, who gave you things in the left hand while the right hand was doing something else entirely. She'd been surrounded by that her whole life. This was different. He wasn't building towards something. He wasn't keeping score. He didn't look at her with that particular calculating patience that meant he was waiting for the right moment to collect what he was owed. He looked at her like she was a person. That was it. That was the whole extraordinary thing. He looked at her like she was simply a person who was there in his space, and that was both sufficient and unremarkable. She had been looked at that way so rarely in her life that she didn't have a good defense against it. A night came in the 7th week when the wind was extraordinary, a sustained howl that came down off the upper peaks and hit the cabin like something with intention. The logs held, the fire held, but the sound was enormous, that constant pressing roar that goes on for hours and starts to do things to your nerves that silence never does. Ronan was sitting in the chair near the fire, unable to sleep, and Mara was on the cot with his coat around her. She had still not given it back. And he had not asked for it, and at some point past midnight, she became aware that he was talking again. Not loudly, barely above the wind. He was telling her about a woman. Not describing her, not narrating a story, exactly more like thinking out loud about a period of his life that he'd carried a long time. A woman he had cared about before the war, who had married someone else while he was gone, which he was careful to say he did not blame her for. "I think the hard part wasn't losing her," he said. The hard part was realizing that the person she'd have been waiting for wasn't coming back anyway. That man was gone before I came home. I just didn't know it yet. The wind hit the cabin broadside and the lamp flame jumped in its glass. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," he said, and then after a pause, "Yes, I do." He didn't say what the reason was. He went quiet after that. After a while, she heard his breathing change and knew he had finally fallen asleep in the chair. Mara lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and felt the particular sensation of being in a great deal of trouble. Not the kind of trouble she knew how to manage. Not the kind with exits you could catalog. The kind that was quiet and warm and arrived not as a threat, but as something much more difficult to resist. She was being seen. After years of making herself invisible, she was being seen not because she had revealed herself, but because Ronan Cade simply looked at things carefully and could not seem to stop noticing. And every time he spoke in the dark, believing she couldn't hear him, every confession, every memory, every small unguarded truth, the weight of what she was carrying got heavier by exactly the measure of how much she understood about him now. She knew about the dog named Birch. She knew about the war and what it had taken. She knew about the woman who hadn't waited and why he didn't blame her. She knew he had spent 3 days arguing with himself about crossing a street. And she knew that every piece of this knowledge had been given to her under false pretenses. He had not chosen to confide in her. He had confided in a silence he thought was permanent, in a person he believed would carry nothing away because she had received nothing. He had put his stories in what he thought was a locked box. The box wasn't locked. It had never been locked. And sometime in the deep middle of that wind-hammered night, with Ronan asleep in the chair 3 feet away and the fire banking down to red coals, Mara Vane understood for the first time in 7 years that her armor had a flaw in it. The flaw was this: armor works against people who want to harm you. It does nothing whatsoever against someone who is simply, quietly, stubbornly kind. She pressed her face against the coat that smelled like wood smoke and pine and mountain air. She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind kept coming, and the mountain absorbed it the way it absorbed everything, without commentary, without complaint, without any sign at all of what it cost. The morning after the windstorm, Ronan woke up in the chair with a crick in his neck and a fire burned down to gray ash. And the first thing he saw when he opened his eyes was Mara already crouched at the hearth, coaxing the coals back to life with small, precise movements, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, his coat still wrapped around her like she'd been born in it. He watched her for a moment before she noticed he was awake. She didn't know he was watching, or he thought she didn't, and so she was unguarded in that way people are when they believe themselves to be alone. There was something in her face that he couldn't read. Not unhappy, not happy exactly. Something more interior than either of those things. Something that lived several layers below the surface of her expression and only showed itself in the small pause she made between each movement, as if each action required a moment of private deliberation before she committed to it. She caught him looking, and her face rearranged itself immediately not into falseness, exactly, but into the more neutral configuration he'd become accustomed to. The one that gave nothing away. He stood up, stretched, and his back made a sound like a green log splitting. He pressed a fist into his lower spine and made a sound that was not dignified, and Mara looked away, which he thought might have been to spare him the embarrassment. Getting too old to sleep in chairs, he said, to no one in particular. He put the coffee on. She had the fire going within minutes, and the cabin warmed fast the way it always did when you had a good fire and tight walls. And by the time the coffee was ready, the worst of the night had been pushed back to the edges of the room where it couldn't do much damage. They ate breakfast in the quiet that had become their usual quiet, not empty, not uncomfortable, but inhabited by whatever it was that had been building between them since the first week. He watched her wrap both hands around her mug and close her eyes over the steam, and he thought, not for the first time, that he knew almost nothing about her, and yet somehow knew more than he could account for. He knew she was not helpless. That had been clear from the first week. Whatever Gertrude Hollis had advertised on that rain-soaked platform, helpless was not the word. She had simply chosen, for whatever reason, to fold herself small, to make herself easy to overlook. He understood that impulse more than he could comfortably admit. What he didn't understand was the extent of what she had endured before Blackthorn Crossing. He had pieced together fragments the thinness of her when she arrived, the way she flinched sometimes at certain sounds that had nothing threatening in them, the systematic nature of her self-erasure that suggested years of practice rather than natural disposition. Whatever had happened to her, it had happened over a long time. He wanted to ask. He knew he couldn't, not in any way she could receive. So he simply existed beside her and tried to be something that didn't require her to be small. The deep winter arrived in the 9th week with a seriousness that even Ronan, after 11 years in the high country, treated with respect. The temperature dropped hard enough that the water in the spring froze to the bottom, and he had to melt snow for everything. The trap lines became treacherous ice under the snow made every step a negotiation, and he came home some evenings with that particular kind of exhaustion that goes past the body and into something deeper. On those nights he was quiet even by his own standards. He ate and sat by the fire and stares at it with the expression of a man sorting through something he hadn't finished sorting through yet. Mara on those nights did not intrude on whatever internal work he was doing. She simply stayed in the room, mending or working with the dried herbs, or doing the small maintenance tasks that accumulated in any cabin through a serious winter, and her presence in the room seemed to be, by some mechanism she didn't fully understand, its own kind of comfort. She knew this because one evening he said so. He was sitting by the fire, and she was at the table, and he said without looking up, "It's easier having someone here." I didn't know it would be. He said it the way he said most things, without looking at her, without expecting response, into the air of the room that he believed received his words and held them. She kept her eyes on her work and held very still, and heard him and let the words go where they went, which was somewhere she had stopped trying to defend against. He said, "I used to wonder if I'd lost the capacity for it, for having someone near." He didn't clarify what it was. He didn't have to. The worst night came on a Thursday. She had been keeping rough track of the days by marking the wall behind the cot with a fingernail, a private habit she'd developed in other places for other reasons. She heard him come in late, later than usual, and she knew before he was fully through the door that something was wrong. He moved wrong, careful in the way that people move when something hurts, and they are trying to hide the extent of it. He got his coat off, but fumbled with the hooks, and had to try twice, and when he finally turned to buff her, she saw his face in the light and felt her stomach drop. He was very pale. The gray-green of his eyes had gone flat, and there was a shine to his skin that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with fever. He had that specific stillness of someone concentrating very hard on staying upright. "I'm fine," he said, which was something he'd said before when he was not fine, and she had learned to gauge the severity of his not fine by how quickly and automatically he said it. This time he said it before she'd even moved toward him. "Just need to warm up," he said. He sat down in the chair by the fire heavily and put his hands on his knees. He was shivering, which was a thing she had not seen him do before. She crossed to him and put her hand on his forehead without asking, and he let her, which told her more than his pallor or his shivering did. Ronan Kay did not readily permit touch. In 2.5 months she could count on one hand the times any physical contact had occurred between them, and each one had been initiated by circumstance rather than intention. The fact that he didn't pull back from her hand meant he was worse than he was pretending. He was burning. She moved fast. She had the fire built higher within minutes, logs pulled from the stack she'd kept drying close to the wall. She got water on to boil. She went to the herb shelf and stood in front of it and thought quickly and carefully about what she knew: the yarrow for fever, the willow bark for pain, the bone set for the bone-deep ache that came with this particular kind of cold sickness. She had learned more in the past weeks from his margin notes and from watching how he used these things than she had known when she arrived. She made the tea. It took time. The willow bark needed longer, and while it steeped, she went back to him and found him slumped slightly in the chair, eyes half open, watching the fire with an expression that had moved past stoicism into something more unguarded than he ever allowed himself to be. "I had this before," he said, without turning. "The winter I first came up here. Spent a week not sure which way it would go." He paused. "There wasn't anyone here then." She brought him the tea and put it in his hands and closed his fingers around the mug the same way he had in that first week, passed her a mug before she had to ask for it, and he looked down at it and then at her, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen on him before. It was not gratitude exactly. It was something rawer than gratitude. Something that looked, if she was being honest with herself, like relief. He drank the tea. She made him drink all of it, replacing the mug with her hand when he tried to set it down half-finished. He didn't argue. He was too tired to argue, which frightened her more than the fever did. She got him to the cot. This was not simple. He was a large man, nearly a foot taller than she was and considerably broader, and he was not fully cooperative because he was not fully conscious of how much help he needed. She got his boots off and his outer shirt and the blanket over him, and he was already shivering harder now that he'd stopped moving, the deep sustained shiver of a body trying to generate heat it couldn't sustain. She went up to the loft. She had never been up there. It was his space. She had understood this without being told, and she had respected it absolutely. But she needed the blankets, and that was more important than any boundary she'd maintained out of courtesy. She found 2 heavy wool blankets folded at the foot of the narrow mattress that occupied most of the loft floor, and she grabbed both and came back down. She piled them on him. He stirred slightly and said something that didn't resolve into words. Then she sat down on the floor beside the cot with her back against it and her knees to her chest because she wasn't going to the loft, and the chair was too far from him, and this was where she needed to be. She sat there and listened to him breathe. The first night was the worst. Fever dreams, or something close to them, he murmured sometimes. Full sentences that dissolved before they completed, fragments of words she couldn't assemble into meaning. She refreshed the fire every hour, checked his temperature with her palm each time she did, forced water between his cracked lips when he was lucid enough to swallow. She made a second batch of tea at 2 a.m. and a third before dawn. He was not getting worse, but he was not getting better. By the second night, she had not slept more than an hour in any continuous stretch. She had established a rhythm fire, water, checked temperature, willow bark every 4 hours, bonesit tea when he was conscious enough to manage it, yarrow compress on his forehead when the fever spiked. She moved through this rhythm with the focused efficiency of someone who has decided that falling apart is simply not scheduled for right now. On the second night, around the darkest part of it, he spoke clearly for the first time in 2 days. Mara, her name in his voice fully formed. She looked up from the floor where she was sitting and found his eyes open and fixed on the ceiling, not focused but not empty either. "Don't go back there," he said. "When this is, don't let them take you back." She sat very still. "Whatever you have to do," he said. His voice was rough from fever and underuse. "Don't go back to that town. Don't let her—" He stopped. Something moved across his face that she couldn't read. "You deserve better than that. You deserve—" He didn't finish the sentence. His eyes drifted closed again. She was very glad in that moment that he could not see her face. She pressed the back of her fingers against his cheek. Still too warm, but the quality of the warmth had changed drier now, less aggressive, the fever working itself toward some kind of resolution rather than climbing. She kept her hand there longer than she needed to for diagnostic purposes. He turned his face slightly toward the touch, the way people do in sleep when something offers warmth without any conscious intention in it. She pulled her hand back. She looked at it. She looked at him. She thought, "I know about the dog named Birch. I know you spent 3 days deciding to cross a street. I know you think the hardest part of the war wasn't the war itself. I know you believe you lost the capacity for having someone near, and I know you said it was easier than you thought. I know all of this because you trusted a silence that was never real. And I don't know how to give any of it back without destroying the only thing that's ever looked like safety." On the third day, his fever broke. She was sitting in the chair. She had finally allowed herself the chair, back aching from 2 days on the floor when she heard his breathing change. She was awake immediately. She crossed to the cot and put her hand to his forehead and felt the difference, still warm, but a reasonable warm, a human warm, not that dry, burning wrongness of the past days. His eyes opened, actually opened with focus in them. He lay there for a moment taking stock of the ceiling. Then he turned his head slowly and found her standing beside the cot, and she watched him assemble the situation from available information. He was in the cot, not the loft. There were more blankets than he owned. The fire was going strong. There was the smell of the herb tea that had become the smell of these past 3 days. He looked at her face for a long moment. "How long?" he said. She held up 3 fingers. Something moved through his expression that was hard to name. He closed his eyes again. "You stayed up. It wasn't a question." She didn't respond. "You didn't have to do that," I said, eyes still closed. She turned to go make him something to eat broth first. She'd had it simmering low, and behind her she heard him say quietly, "Thank you." Just those 2 words. The same 2 words he'd said over the bandaged hand weeks ago, but carrying considerably more weight this time, the full weight of 3 nights, and the understanding of what 3 nights cost. She kept walking to the fire. She did not let him see her face. He recovered slowly, the way large men often do when they finally get sick, all that resistance, and then a collapse that takes time to come back from. She managed his recovery with the same focused practicality she had brought to the worst of it. Broth rest, the tea 3 times a day. Short walks to the door and back when he was well enough, because she'd read in his margin notes that a man who lay still too long in winter recovery risked the lungs filling, and she wasn't going to let that happen after everything. He was a difficult patient in specific ways. He was not complaining. He was not demanding. He simply kept trying to do things before he was ready to do them, motivated by some deep, stubborn conviction that needing rest was a character flaw. She stopped him from going out to check the barn on the 4th day by simply standing in front of the door. He looked at her. She looked back. He sat back down. "You're bossy," he said. There was something in his voice that might have been the very earliest ancestor of amusement. "For a woman who doesn't talk." She pointed to the chair. He sat in it. On the 5th day of his recovery, he was well enough to be restless, which she took as a good sign and also found immediately exhausting. He sat by the fire and fidgeted with the harness leather and looked out the small window at the snow-buried mountain and was generally present in the way that recovering people are fully occupying the space again, that particular aliveness returning to his movements even when the movements were small. "I owe you something," he said that evening. She was at the table and she looked up and he was watching her with a directness that he didn't usually permit himself, the kind of looking that he normally redirected away before it settled into anything. "I don't mean money," he said quickly. "I know you don't. I'm not." He stopped. Tried again. His jaw was tight in the way it got when he was making himself say something he'd rather carry quietly. "I mean, I owe you the acknowledgement of it, that you kept me alive. That you stayed up for 3 days doing it. And I don't take that for nothing." He looked down at the harness leather. The tendons in his jaw moved once. "I was going to send you down to a boarding house in the spring," he said. "Give you money to start somewhere. Get you away from. Get you somewhere better than this." She had not known he had been planning this. She kept her face arranged correctly and said nothing. "I've been thinking about that," he said, "whether that's the right thing." He didn't say what conclusion he'd reached. He picked up the harness and turned it over in his hands and said, somewhat roughly, "Go to sleep. You haven't slept properly in 5 days." She went to sleep. But she lay on the cot in the firelight for a long time before sleep came, turning over those words. "I've been thinking about whether that's the right thing." Parsing the uncertainty in them. The fact that a plan he'd arrived, with the plan he'd probably built on the ride down to Blackthorn Crossing, the justification for crossing the street was no longer sitting comfortably enough to leave unexamined. She thought about the spring, about the boarding house, about enough money to start somewhere. These were not bad things. These were, by any reasonable accounting, generous things. She thought about the chair by the fire and the matched rhythm of their evenings and the coat she still wore that smelled like wood smoke and mountain air. She thought about the water already hot when he came in cold. She thought about the 3 nights on the floor and how not once during those 3 nights had she thought about leaving. She thought about what it meant that she had been on a mountain for 11 weeks with a man who spoke his private truths to a silence he believed was permanent, and somehow those truths had found their way into her hands. And she had been holding them so carefully and for so long that they had started to feel like they belonged there, which was exactly the kind of thinking that was going to ruin everything. Because the spring would come, the passes would open, and there would be a morning when he saddled the horses and handed her money and pointed her toward a town with a boarding house and a future that did not include 11 years of solitude in the high country, and a man who was still, by his own admission, not sure what he had the capacity for. And she would have to either go down that mountain with a lie still intact between them, or she would have to surrender the one thing that had kept her safe for 7 years. She lay in the dark and listened to him breathe steadily in the loft above her, the good breathing, the healthy breathing. The breathing she had stayed up 3 nights to preserve, and she understood very clearly that she had stopped being able to think of this place as temporary. She also understood, with a clarity that arrived like cold water, that the longer she waited to tell him the truth, the more complete the betrayal would be when it finally came. Because it would come. She knew it would come. The lie had been useful once. The way a splint is useful on a broken bone, you need it while things are healing, but eventually you have to take it off, or the bone heals wrong. The question was whether she had waited too long already, whether the bone had healed wrong already, whether what she would see on his face when she told him would be what she was afraid she would see. She pressed her eyes shut. Outside, the mountain pressed its cold and enormous silence against the walls of the cabin, and somewhere deep in the snowpack, something shifted, a small sound, barely more than a whisper, the mountain settling into itself the way old things do. And Mara Vane, who had not spoken a true word in 7 years, lay in the dark and listened to it, and said nothing. Not yet. The first sign of spring came not as warmth but as sound. Mara noticed it before Ronan did a dripping somewhere off the east eave of the cabin, slow and irregular, the sound of ice deciding to become water again. It was barely a change. The temperature hadn't shifted enough to feel it through the walls. But that sound was different from the sounds winter made, and she lay on the cot in the gray early morning and listened to it and felt something in her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with cold. Ronan noticed it 2 days later. He came in from the barn and stopped just inside the door and tilted his head slightly, the way he did when he was listening to something he was still identifying. Then he looked at the window, then at the floor. He didn't say anything immediately, which was how she knew it meant something to him. The things that meant most to him arrived in silence first. That evening he said, without preamble, "Pass will be clear in 6 weeks. Maybe 5 if this keeps up." He was looking at the fire. She was at the table with the mending, the same position they'd occupied through hundreds of evenings by now, and she kept her eyes on the cloth in her hands and made no movement that would indicate she'd heard him. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what I told you before. About the boarding house." She set down the mending. She did this carefully, the way you set down something fragile. "There's a decent one in Harwick," he said, 2 days south of Blackthorn. "I've passed it. The woman who runs it she's respectable. She doesn't let rooms to the wrong kind." He paused. "I've got enough set aside. You'd have time to find work before it ran out." He was still looking at the fire. The light made the gray in his beard look silver, made the lines of his face deeper than they were in daylight. "It's a better life than this," he said. "A real town. People. Things to do that aren't just keeping alive." She picked the mending back up. She didn't trust her hands without something to do with them. "You'd be all right," he said. He said it like he was trying to convince himself of something. "You're capable. You figured out this place in 2 weeks. You'd figure out anything." The fire snapped. Something in the log shifted, and a small avalanche of coals resettled themselves with a soft crushing sound. "Mara." She looked up. He was looking at her now directly. that rare direct look that he usually redirected before it meant something. "You should have better than this mountain," he said. "That's all I'm saying." She held his gaze for 3 full seconds, which was longer than she usually permitted. Then she looked back down at the mending, and she stitched 2 careful stitches, and she thought about Harwick and a respectable boarding house and a woman who didn't let rooms to the wrong kind. She thought about real towns and people and things to do that weren't just keeping alive. She thought, "I have been alive here in a way I have not been anywhere else." She didn't say it. She stitched another careful stitch and said nothing at all. The weeks that followed had a different quality to them. Not worse, exactly, but changed the way a room changes when you know you're leaving it. She found herself noticing things she had stopped noticing because they had become ordinary, the specific way the morning light came through the east window and fell across the plank floor. The sound the barn door made in the wind, the particular pattern of the grain in the wood of the table where she had spent so many evenings. Ronan was different too, though she doubted he would have admitted it or perhaps even recognized it. He was more careful around her, not unfriendly, not distant, but careful in the way of a man who has established a boundary for himself and is making sure he respects it. He spoke less in the evenings, not the comfortable inhabited silence of winter, but a more deliberate quiet, a quiet with intention behind it. She understood what he was doing. He was beginning the process of detaching. The practical, unsentimental work of a man who had decided that getting attached to something he was going to lose was a waste of whatever he had left to spend. She understood it because she had done it herself, many times in many places. The careful diminishment of investment, the internal stepping back, the practiced art of making yourself smaller inside a situation so that when it ended the damage was manageable. She was furious with him for it, not externally. Externally, she was exactly what she had always been: quiet, functional, neutral. But internally, she was carrying a low, furious burn at the fact that he was doing what she had always done, was using the same survival mechanism she had spent 7 years perfecting. And somehow watching it from the outside made her see it for what it was. Protective, yes. Functional, yes. Also a kind of preemptive surrender to a loss that hadn't happened yet. A way of losing things before they could be taken. She was doing it too, she recognized this. She was allowing the weeks to pass, watching the drip from the eave become a trickle and then a small persistent stream, and she was not saying anything, not doing anything, simply folding herself smaller inside the situation the way she always had, and she was angry at herself for it in the same low way she was angry at him. They were both, she thought, very stupid people who had gotten very good at protecting themselves. One afternoon, in what she calculated was the 15th week, she came in from the spring to find him at the table with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil, writing something. He folded it quickly when he heard the door, not guilty exactly but self-conscious, in a way that told her she'd seen something he hadn't intended her to see. She set the water down and went about her business and did not look at the paper. That night, after he had gone up to the loft, she sat by the dying fire and thought about the folded paper, and she thought about Harwick, and she thought about the spring that was coming, and she thought about what she was going to do about any of it. She had been thinking about this for weeks. She had been going around and around it the way you go around a sinkhole in a field, aware of it, carefully avoiding it, getting things done around its edges, but never actually addressing the fact of it. The fact of it was simple. She had been lying to him for 15 weeks. Not actively, not with fabricated stories or invented details, she had simply allowed him to believe a false thing and had not corrected it. She had let him speak his private truths to what he believed was a permanent silence. She had accumulated knowledge of him that he had never intended to give her. And she loved him. She had known this for weeks. She had known it precisely since the night he lay in the fever and said, "Don't let them take you back. You deserve better than that," half delirious, unable to tell her this in any state where he had control over whether he said it. She had known it, and she had added it to everything else she was holding: the dog named Birch, the war, the woman who hadn't waited, the 3 days on the trail, arguing with himself, and she had said nothing. Because telling him would mean explaining why she hadn't told him earlier. And explaining that meant showing him the full extent of it, not just that she could hear, but how long and how much. Every evening by the fire, every night in the windstorm, everything he had believed he was saying to empty air. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. The spring was coming. The pass would be clear in perhaps 3 weeks now. And she could go to Harwick and a respectable boarding house and carry all of this away with her, carry it quietly the way she carried everything. And Ronan Cade would never know that the silence he had trusted was never real, and he would be what? Fine. He would be fine. He had been fine before she came. The thought sat in her stomach like a stone. He had been fine. He had also been alone for 11 years and had told her in the dark that he hadn't known how much easier it was with someone there, and that he'd wondered if he'd lost the capacity for it. She took her hands from her eyes. She looked at the coals. "You're very stupid," she told herself, "and you have been for a long time." The morning he saddled the horses, she was not surprised. She had felt it coming the way you feel weather, not in any one sign, but in the accumulated shift of pressure. He had been quieter than ever the previous 2 days. He had spent an evening going through his stores and dividing things into 2 categories whose logic she understood with a cold sinking in her gut, things that were his and things she might need for a journey. He saddled both horses in the barn while she stood in the doorway of the cabin and watched the morning light hit the clearing. It was a real spring morning, finally warm enough to feel it. The snow retreating from the south-facing slopes, small pale things pushing up in the mud at the edge of the tree line. The kind of morning that, in another life, she might have found genuinely beautiful. She went inside. She took his coat from the peg by the door. She had returned it to the peg 3 weeks ago, a small concession to the diminishment they were both practicing, and she held it for a moment. Then she hung it back on the peg. She thought, if I walk out of this cabin and onto that horse, it's because I chose to. Not because there was nowhere else to go, not because he's making me. Because I chose it. She thought, is that what I'm choosing? He came in from the barn. He was wearing his trail coat and his hat, and he had that set expression he sometimes wore when he was making himself do something difficult by making his face unavailable for commentary. He crossed to the shelf and took down the leather pouch. He set it on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then he picked it up and carried it to her and held it out. "It's $40, he said. "It's enough for 6 months at the boarding house. More if you're careful." He paused. "You'll be careful." She looked at the pouch. She looked at his face. He was not looking at her eyes. He was looking at a point somewhere near her collarbone. The way people look when they are delivering a verdict they believe is right and are not fully surviving the process. She took the pouch. She held it in both hands. "The pass is clear enough," he said. 2 days to Harwick if the lower trail is passable, which it should be." He cleared his throat. "I'll ride with you as far as the valley." He turned toward the door. She threw the pouch down. It hit the floor and landed without drama, a small leather bag with $40 in it. Lying on the plank floor between them, and the sound it made was not large, but in the silence of the cabin, it was very loud. Ronan stopped. He turned around slowly. She was standing very straight. Her hands, now empty, were at her sides. She was looking directly at him, not at his collarbone, not at the floor, directly at his face, and she was aware that whatever her face was doing right now, she no longer had control of it. He looked at the pouch on the floor. He looked at her. She shook her head, one sharp motion. His jaw tightened. She watched him try to read what was happening, watched him scroll through his available interpretations. He settled. She could see it. On the one that made the most sense to him, she was afraid. Afraid of the town, afraid of strangers, afraid of the unknown shape of a life she hadn't lived yet. He thought she was refusing the pouch because she was frightened of what came after it. "It's going to be all right," he said, in the voice he sometimes used with the horses when they were uncertain. Even, low, careful. I don't want to leave." The words came out of her mouth and hit the air of the cabin and stayed there. 4 words, rough-edged and unpolished, shaped by a voice that had been dormant for 7 years and had not had time to remember how to be elegant about anything. Not whispered, she hadn't been capable of a whisper in that moment. They had come out at something between a murmur and a declaration, her voice breaking slightly on the last word, the way a door breaks open when you've been leaning against it for a very long time. Ronan Cade went completely still, not the stillness of a man pausing. The stillness of a man whose entire internal framework has just been rearranged without warning. He stared at her. She held his gaze and felt everything she'd been holding for 15 weeks pressing against the inside of her chest, and she thought, there it is. No going back from that. What, he said, not a question exactly. More like the single word a person produces when language has momentarily failed them and they need something to stand on while they recover. I don't want to leave, she said again. Her voice was steadier this time. It sounded strange to her, lower than she remembered it, rougher, like something dug out of the ground rather than the careful, cultivated thing it had been before she stopped using it. I don't want to go to Harik. I don't want the boarding house. He hadn't moved. His hat was in his hands. Now he'd taken it off at some point, and she hadn't seen it happen, and he was holding it with both hands the way people hold things when they need something to hold. You can, he started. I can hear, she said. The hat stopped moving in his hands. I could always hear, she said, since before you found me. The silence that followed this was different from any silence the cabin had contained before. It was not comfortable or inhabited, or the particular textured quiet of two people who had learned to coexist. It was a silence with mass to it, with edges. She watched his face. She had been watching his face for 15 weeks, had learned it the way you learn terrain, every expression that passed through it, every small involuntary shift. She had never seen it do what it was doing now. It was very still, which was different from his usual stillness. His usual stillness was composed. This was the stillness of a man whose composure was currently structural, holding everything up from the inside while the outside showed nothing. Since when, he said. 2 words, flat. Since I was 13, she said. I lost my hearing, for there was an injury, when I was 12. When it came back, I had learned what happened around someone people thought couldn't hear. She kept her voice level. She was not going to cry. She had decided this. I kept pretending. It kept me safer. He looked at the floor, at the pouch lying there. And here, he said. Yes, this winter, yes. He looked up. Everything I said. She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. They both knew the answer. His jaw worked. She watched it. She watched him absorb this the evenings by the fire, the wind-hammered night when he'd talked about the woman who hadn't waited, the 3 days on the trail, the fever. Don't let them take you back. You deserve better than that. She watched him understand the inventory of what she had received and held. He turned away from her. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, one hand on the wall, looking out at the clearing. The horses were visible at the post, tacked and ready. She waited. She had gotten good at waiting. It was one of the things she'd always been best at, and she stood in the middle of the cabin and held what she was feeling and waited for him to finish whatever internal work he was doing. It took a while. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. Still controlled, but with something underneath it she couldn't immediately identify. You heard everything, he said, to the window. Yes. You stayed anyway. Yes, another long pause. Why didn't you tell me? It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine question, asked in a genuine voice, which was harder to receive than an accusation would have been. At first because I didn't know you, she said. I'd been in places where people hurt me. The silence was how I survived that. She paused, and then the longer I waited, the harder it was. Because I knew more, and you had said those things because you thought they were safe to say, and I... She stopped, started again. I didn't want you to feel like I had stolen them, she said. I was trying to figure out how to give them back without I don't know. Without breaking something. He turned from the window. His face had done something she hadn't seen it do before. Not softened exactly, Softened was the wrong word for a face like his, which had been shaped by too much weather and too much time for anything as simple as softening. But the structural quality of it had changed. The thing he had been holding from the inside had shifted, rearranged itself into something that was still composed, but differently composed. Something that had room in it. "You kept me alive," he said. 3 nights. Yes. And you heard me during that. Yes, he sat down. Not in the chair by the fire, not at the table, he simply sat down on the step of the raised hearth, like his legs had decided they were done being stood on for the moment. He set the hat on his knee. He looked at the floor. "The dog," he said. "Birch." "I know about Birch," she said quietly. He pressed a hand over his mouth briefly. Then he dropped it. He looked at her, and for the first time since she had spoken, her face was not the only exposed one in the room. "The woman," he said, "before the war. I know about her too." "And you didn't—" He stopped. His voice had roughened. "You didn't use any of it." She frowned slightly. "Use it for what?" "I don't know. Leverage." He shook his head. "People use things." "I know," she said. "I grew up with people who used things." "That's not—" She stopped herself. Tried again. "That's not why I was listening." "Why were you listening?" She looked at him, sitting on the hearth step, with his hat on his knee and his exposed face, and she thought about how to answer this honestly and in words her rough, unused voice could carry without breaking. "Because you were the first person who ever talked to me like I was worth talking to," she said. "Even when you thought I couldn't hear you, you talked to me like what you were saying mattered." She paused. "Most people talk at someone they think can't hear. You talked to me. Even then." He was very still. "I didn't want to stop hearing it," she said. "I know that was wrong. I know it was. I know what it cost you. What I took from you without asking." She looked at the pouch on the floor. "If you want me to go to Harwick, I'll go. I'll take the money and I'll go. I'm not—" Her voice caught slightly. She steadied it. "I'm not asking you to be all right with what I did. I'm just telling you why." She stopped talking. The cabin was very quiet. Outside, one of the horses shifted at the post, a small sound of movement, the creak of leather. Ronan looked at the pouch on the floor for a long time. Then he leaned down and picked it up. He held it for a moment, weighing it the same way he had weighed it across the street in Blackthorn Crossing before he called the last bid. Then he set it on the hearth beside him. "What's your voice like, normally?" "When you've been using it," she blinked. Of everything she had expected him to say, this was not in the inventory. "I don't know," she said. "It's been 7 years." "Sounds all right now," he said. "Rough, but all right." She didn't know what to do with that. He picked up his hat. He turned it over once in his hands. He said without looking at her, "When you were 12. "The injury. My stepmother," she said the first time. His hands went very still on the hat. The first time, he repeated. "There were other times," she said, after. She watched something move through him, not visible in any dramatic way, not a flinch or a change of posture. Just a very subtle, very complete shift in the quality of his stillness, the way a river changes when a large stone is dropped into it. The surface barely disturbs, the depth rearranges entirely. He stood up. He walked to the door of the cabin and opened it and stood in the doorway with his back to her, looking out at the clearing and the horses and the morning and the mountains beyond. And she let him stand there because she understood the need for something to look at that wasn't the inside of a room. She waited. After what might have been 3 minutes or might have been 10, he came back inside. He pulled the door closed behind him. He walked to where the horses were visible through the window, and she realized after a moment that he wasn't looking at the horses. He was looking at his own reflection in the glass, or more specifically, at whatever he could see past it. "I said something," he said, "on the trail the first day. I said nobody was going to hurt you, I remember." "I meant it," he said. "I still mean it." She was quiet. "But I need you to understand something," he said. He turned from the window. "When I talk about things, the war, Birch, all of it, I don't do that. I don't talk about that. I did it because I thought." "Because you thought it was safe," she said. "Yes." "Because you thought I wasn't really there." A long pause. Yes, I was always really there, she said. He looked at her. She looked back at him. I know that now, he said. Something about the way he said it, not angry, not resigned, but something that had moved past both of those into a more complicated place, made her chest hurt in a specific way. Are you angry with me? She said. He considered this with a seriousness that told her he was actually examining the question rather than reaching for the ready-made answer. I don't know yet, he said. I think I'm going to have to sit with it for a while. That's fair, she said. It's a lot to sit with. I know. He looked at the pouch on the hearth, then at her, then at the door as if calculating something. Then he crossed to the door and opened it again, and she thought for one long, cold second that he was going to walk out of it, was going to go to the barn and unsaddle the horses and put himself somewhere. She wasn't until he had decided what to do with everything she had handed him. Instead, he reached out and unhooked the horses from the post. She heard him lead them back toward the barn. She heard the barn door open and close. She stood in the middle of the cabin and looked at the pouch on the hearth and listened to the sounds of him putting the horses away. He was not leaving. He came back inside 15 minutes later. He hung his hat on the peg. He took his trail coat off and hung it too. He went to the shelf and took down 2 mugs and put the coffee on, and all of these actions were ordinary, practical things that he did with his back to her, and she watched his back and tried to read what was in it and couldn't, not entirely. When the coffee was ready, he poured 2 mugs and set one on the table on her side and took the other one and sat down in the chair by the fire. He wrapped both hands around the mug. He looked at the fire. She sat down across from him at the table. They sat in silence for a long time. Not the old silence, not the new terrible silence of the revelation and its weight. Something else, something that had the quality of 2 people sitting in the same ruins and deciding, separately but at the same time, what might be worth salvaging. Tell me something, he said finally. She looked up. Something real, he said. Something you actually want to say. Not an answer to something I asked. Just something you've been thinking about. She looked at him, sitting in the firelight with his rough face and his gray threaded beard and the mug in his hands, and she thought about all the things she had been thinking about for 15 weeks that had never made it to the air of the room. The morning after the windstorm, she said, when you woke up in the chair, you had no idea what you looked like. He waited. You looked like someone who had been human all night without choosing to be, she said. Like you'd accidentally let yourself be a person. She paused. I thought it was the most. I thought you looked more like yourself in that moment than any other time I had seen you. He was quiet for a moment. That's not a flattering image, he said. No, she agreed. It's true, though. Something crossed his face. It moved through quickly, there and gone. But she caught it because she had been cataloging his expressions for 15 weeks, and she recognized it. It was the very earliest ancestor of something that might become, over time, if things went the way they might go, the first note of what could eventually be called happiness. He looked back at the fire. She looked at her coffee. Neither of them looked at the pouch on the hearth. Neither of them picked it up. The pouch stayed on the hearth for 3 days. Neither of them moved it. Neither of them mentioned it. It sat there at the edge of every meal and every evening like a small patient argument that neither of them was ready to finish, and they both, by some unspoken agreement, simply left it where it was and went about the business of existing in the same space under entirely new terms. The first day after the revelation was the hardest. Not because of cruelty. Ronan was not a cruel man. She had established this within the first week, and nothing since had revised it, but because of the specific grinding discomfort of 2 people who have learned each other one way and must now learn each other again from a different position. Everything that had become automatic between them became conscious. She was aware of every sound she made, every word she chose, aware of herself in the room in a way she hadn't been since the first terrifying days of the cabin. He was aware, too. She could see him choosing his words before he released them, turning each one over, checking the weight of it, checking who it was now being said to. The ease they had built through 15 weeks didn't disappear. But it went underground for a while, hiding underneath the self-consciousness of a situation that had been fundamentally rearranged. He asked her questions. Not all at once, he parceled them out the way a careful man uses a limited supply of something, making sure each question was the one he most needed answered before he spent it. The first came that same evening, after the coffee had gone cold and the fire had dropped to coals. He had been quiet for a long time, and she had been sitting at the table not doing anything in particular, just sitting, which was something she had never quite been able to do before this mountain. "Your stepmother," he said. She knew you could hear. It wasn't phrased as a question, but she understood it as one. Toward the end, maybe, she said. I think she suspected. But she needed the money more than she needed to be right about it. He absorbed this. How long were you with her? Since I was 9. My father died when I was 8. She came the year after. And the first time she hurt you, I was 12. There was a man she wanted to impress. I was in the way of that. She said it plainly, the way you state a fact that has been a fact long enough that your body no longer responds to it the way it once did. She watched him receive it, watched that deep river shift she had seen the day before, the surface barely disturbing, the depth rearranging completely. The hearing loss, he said, it came back over about 8 months. Not all at once. Sounds first, then voices, then one morning I could hear birds outside the window, and I lay there and didn't tell anyone. She paused. I realized people were different around someone they thought couldn't hear. More careless, more honest. I started using that. How old were you? 13. He was quiet for a long moment. 13 years old, he said finally, to no one in particular. Not to her, not to the fire. Just putting the words in the air, the way he put so many words simply because they needed to exist somewhere outside his head. It worked, she said. It kept me safe for 7 years. Until it didn't, he said. She thought about the auction platform. The rain, Gertrude at the edge of the crowd counting coins. Until it didn't, she agreed. The second question came the following morning. He was at the table with his coffee and she was tending the fire, and he said, without looking up, when you decided to stay quiet up here, did you know how long you were going to do it? She turned from the fire. No. At first I was in survival mode. I didn't know you. I needed time to understand what I was dealing with. And then she looked at the fire, and then I started to know you. And it got more complicated. He nodded slowly. He drank his coffee and didn't ask the follow-up that was sitting right behind that one. She appreciated this. She was not ready for the follow-up. The third question came on the third evening, and it was the one she had been waiting for. He was in the chair by the fire in the position she could have drawn from memory, the angle of his shoulders, the mug in both hands, the particular tilt of his head when he was working something out. When you heard me during the fever, he said, the things I said. About you going back, about what you deserved, he stopped. His jaw worked once. I wasn't in my right mind for most of that. I know, she said. What I'm asking is, he exhaled. He was struggling, and she let him struggle because the thing he was trying to say was worth saying correctly. I'm asking if you knew that I wouldn't, that I didn't normally. Ronan, she said. He looked at her. She had not used his name before. In 15 weeks, she had never needed to. They were 2 people in one cabin. There was no ambiguity about who was being addressed. Hearing her say it did something to his face. I know the difference, she said, between someone performing goodness and someone actually being it. I have had enough experience with both to know the difference very clearly. She held his gaze. I was never confused about what you were. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked away. The firelight caught the silver in his beard. I need a few more days, he said. Take them, she said. She meant it. She gave them freely, without scorekeeping, without the anxious monitoring of someone checking whether forgiveness was arriving at an acceptable rate. She understood that what she had asked him to process was substantial, and that Ronan Cade processed things slowly and thoroughly, and in private, and that rushing this would be like trying to rush the season you could attempt it. But the thing you were rushing had its own timeline and did not consult yours. She filled the days with the ordinary work she had always done, and she let her voice into the air of the cabin in small increments. Practical things first. The water barrel needed refilling. There was a problem with the barn door latch. Did he want the rest of the beans, or should she put them away? Small utterances, carefully placed, like testing ice before you put your full weight on it. He answered her. Each time he answered. He was still carrying the weight of the recalibration, still sorting through everything she had turned over and laid on the table. But each time she spoke, he met the words and responded to them. That was the thing she held on to. He kept responding. On the 6th day, he came in from the trap lines with 2 rabbits and a different look on his face. He laid the rabbits on the counter and turned and said, "Without preamble, I've been thinking about what you said. About why you didn't tell me." She set down what she was doing and waited. "You said you were trying to figure out how to give it back without breaking something," he said. "Yes. What did you think would break?" She considered this honestly because he deserved honesty, and she had decided that honesty was the only thing she was going to be from here forward, whatever it cost. "You," she said, "or the thing between us, whatever we had built. I thought if I told you the truth, you would feel deceived, and you would send me away, and everything that had happened here would become something bad. Something I had done to you, instead of something we had." She stopped. She couldn't find the end of that sentence. "Instead of something we had together," he said. "Yes," she said. "That." He leaned against the counter and crossed his arms and looked at the floor for a moment. "And now that you've told me, now I don't know what it is," she said. "I know what I want it to be. That's different from knowing what it is." "What do you want it to be?" She looked at him directly. What it was, minus the lie. Something moved through his expression, not resolution, not yet, but the beginning of the path toward it. The first step onto ground that might hold. "That's not nothing," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's not." He turned back to the rabbits and began preparing them, and she went back to the table. And the silence that came over the cabin had a different quality from any silence that had preceded it. It was the silence of turned-over ground before planting. Of 2 people sitting in the same wreckage and deciding separately but simultaneously what might be worth keeping. She thought, "We are going to be all right." She did not say it. She had learned from long practice not to name the thing you most needed to be true before it had fully arrived. But she thought it, and she let herself think it, and the thinking alone felt like a different kind of air. The first time she laughed in the cabin, she surprised them both. It was perhaps 2 weeks after the revelation, an unremarkable afternoon with nothing extraordinary about it. Ronan was attempting to fix the cabinet hinge that had been stiff all winter, applying to it the same method he had applied to most mechanical problems in her observation, increasing force in the direction he had already decided was correct, with mounting conviction that more of the same approach would eventually produce a different result. She watched him push the hinge for the 3rd time. She watched it resist for the 3rd time. She watched his jaw set in a way that communicated he was prepared to do this indefinitely. Something rose up in her chest that she had not felt in. She genuinely could not remember the last time she had felt it. It came out before she could stop it, a short, sharp sound, involuntary, her hand going to her mouth a half-second too late. Ronan turned around with the hinge in one hand and an expression of such thoroughly performed offense that it made everything worse immediately. "I'd like to see you do better," he said. She pressed her lips together. Her eyes were doing something she couldn't control. "It's not funny," he said in a tone that conceded entirely that it was. "You're pushing when you should be pulling," she managed. He looked at the hinge. He tried pulling. The hinge, which had been resisting applied force all afternoon, seated itself immediately with a small, satisfied click. He stood there, holding the now functional cabinet door, and said nothing for 3 full seconds. "Don't," he said. She laughed. A real one this time, longer, fuller, coming from somewhere that had been locked for years and was now open, imperfect and rough-edged and absolutely genuine. It sounded strange to her, her own laughter after so long, lower than she remembered it being, but real in a way that nothing performed could approximate. He watched her laugh. His face cracked just at the corner of his mouth, the deep, reluctant crease of a man losing a fight with amusement that he had intended to win. The hinge was already loosening, he said. Of course it was. I had nearly solved it. Nearly, she agreed. Yes. He hung the cabinet door, pushed it once with great dignity, and turned away from it. She looked at the ceiling. Neither of them mentioned the hinge again. But something had moved between them, in a better direction this time. Her voice came back unevenly, the way strength returns after long illness, some days more present than others, some mornings rough and abbreviated, other times surprising her with its own range and steadiness. She talked more as the weeks passed, not just practical things. Observations, questions, opinions she had previously carried in silence and was now putting into the air to see what happened to them. What happened was that he listened. He didn't always respond. At length he was still fundamentally a man who used words sparingly, but he listened with that same quality of attention she had first recognized in the early weeks, the attention that felt, from the receiving end, like being taken seriously. She had been hungry for that for longer than she had a name for, and she was only now understanding the extent of the hunger by the way it responded to being fed. One evening she told him about her father. She had not talked about him. In years there had been no one safe to talk to, and silence had become the place where he lived, alongside everything else she'd stored there. He had been a quiet man, her father, most at ease outdoors, good at fixing things and growing things, good at being present in the way that some people simply are, naturally without effort. She told Ronan about the garden, the specific smell of tomato plants in summer, the way her father had showed her how to check soil moisture with 2 fingers. The quality of his voice when he was explaining something he cared about lower, slower, like he wanted the words to have time to land. She told it plainly, without performance, just the facts of a man who had existed and been loved, and then was gone when she was 8 years old. Ronan listened through all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He sounds like he was good at being present, he said. She thought about this. Yes, that's exactly what he was good at. That's rarer than people think, Ronan said. I know. She looked at the fire. You're good at it too. You just don't know it. He looked at her sideways. I live alone on a mountain. You're present anyway, she said. Just for yourself, for whatever's in front of you. A pause. For me this winter. He looked at the fire for a moment. I didn't know anyone was watching. That's how I know it's real, she said. He didn't answer that, but he held her gaze for a moment that lasted 3 or 4 seconds longer than it needed to, and in Ronan Cade's economy of expression, 3 or 4 seconds was a considerable thing. The rifle appeared on the table one morning in what she calculated to be the 20th week. She looked at it, then at him. I've been thinking, he said, which was how he began approximately half the important things he said, that you should know how to use it. She looked at the rifle more carefully. It was not the one he used daily. This was lighter, a cleaner thing, less battered. Where did this come from, she said. Traded for it, he said. Last time I was in Blackthorn. She looked at him. You went to Blackthorn without telling me. You were asleep, Ronan. Do you want to learn to shoot or not? He said, in a tone indicating the Blackthorn conversation was closed from his end. She wanted to learn. She did not entirely concede the Blackthorn conversation, but she set it aside. He was a patient teacher.
This genuinely surprised her. She had expected efficiency,
The kind of expectation that
comprehension,
would arrive,
promptly because the explanation had been clear.
and what more was needed. But he wasn't like that. He showed her things 2, 3 times, adjusting his approach each time, rather than simply repeating himself at greater volume. He taught her the hold, which took longer than expected, because her instinct was consistently wrong in one specific way he kept correcting. He taught her to breathe into the shot the relationship between breath and hand steadiness, the pause between inhale and exhale where everything settles. He taught her about distance and wind, and how light changes what your eye reports to your brain. She was not good at it immediately, and it would be wrong to say otherwise. She missed badly and repeatedly, in ways that caused Ronan to press his lips together in an expression that was carefully not a smile. She argued with him once about a point of technique, was proven wrong by the evidence, and acknowledged this with a directness that she could tell he hadn't expected. "You're gripping too hard," he said, the fourth time on a particular morning. "I'm not. Look at your knuckles," she looked. They were white. "There it is," she said. "There it is," he said, with no particular satisfaction, which was its own kind of patience. She got better. Slowly, imperfectly, through accumulated small corrections and repeated failure and the incremental improvement that comes from simply refusing to stop. By the third week, she could hit a standing target reliably at a distance Ronan called respectable. "Don't say respectable," she said. "I mean it as a compliment." It doesn't land as one. He considered this. "You're getting good." "Getting," she said. At this stage, he said, almost to himself, in a way that suggested he was aware of what he was doing. She loaded the rifle again. The afternoon, she hit the distant tin, the one at the far edge of the clearing that Ronan had set up as a long-term goal, mentioned casually, without ceremony, the kind of goal meant to take months. He was standing 10 feet to her left, watching without comment the way he did when she was concentrating. She sighted, she breathed, she let the breath settle into its natural pause. She fired. The tin jumped from its post and hit the ground. She lowered the rifle. She looked at the fallen tin. Then she turned to look at Ronan. He was looking at her, not the target. She could tell by the angle of his head that he had been watching her face, not tracking the shot. He had been less interested in whether she hit the tin than in what her face would do when she did. He walked toward her. Not quickly. Ronan Cade did nothing quickly that could be done deliberately, crossing the 10 feet with the same unhurried weight he brought to everything. He stopped when he reached her, and he was close, closer than the usual practical distance they maintained between themselves. Close enough that she could see the exact color of his eyes, that gray-green she had never found a word for and had stopped trying to. He put one hand on the side of her face. His palm was rough from years of trap work and timber and mountain winters, and it was warm, and the care in it went through every layer of everything she had ever built to keep herself intact. She went still, not the survival stillness of years of practice. The stillness of someone who has arrived somewhere and does not want to move in case it turns out not to be real. He kissed her. It was not long. It was not elegant. It was the kind of kiss that belongs to someone who has been turning a thing over and over for a long time and has finally found where it goes and set it down there. It tasted like wood smoke and coffee and something she didn't have a name for. When he pulled back, he was still close. His hand was still at her face. She looked at him. He looked at her. "I've been working up to that for a while," he said. "I know," she said. Something shifted in his expression. "How long have you known?" She considered the honest answer, decided the honest answer might require more conversation than the moment could hold, and said, "A few weeks." He regarded her with a steadiness that communicated he did not entirely believe this. He let it go. "Mara," he said. "Yes. I'm not an easy person." He said this with the particular tone of someone issuing a fair disclosure rather than an apology. "I've been alone a long time. There are things in me that don't work right. I'm going to get things wrong, and I'm going to do it often, and I'm not always going to know when I'm doing it." "I know," she said. "You're 20 years old. I'm 41. I've got nightmares and a trap line and a cabin that leaks in the north corner every spring melt." "I know about the corner," she said. "I've been managing it since February." "That's not the point." "Then what is?" He looked at her. "The point is, you should understand what you're choosing." "Ronan," she said, "I have been here 5 months. I have seen you sick and well and difficult and patient, and in the dark when you thought no one was listening." She held his gaze without flinching. "I know exactly what I am choosing." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, the short, decisive nod of a man who has made a decision and has stopped second-guessing it. He stepped back. He looked at the fallen tin, then crossed the clearing to set it back on its post, because there were things that needed doing, and they were not people who stopped doing them because the world had shifted. But when he walked back past her toward the cabin, his hand found hers briefly a passing contact, a touch and then gone, and she felt the warmth of it stay in her palm long after he had gone inside. She stood in the clearing alone. The mountains surrounded her, enormous and indifferent in the way that mountains are, neither hostile nor welcoming, simply there in their old and patient way. The spring air moved through the tree line with a softness that winter had made her forget was possible. Small pale things had pushed up through the mud at the edge of the clearing. The creek was running fast and clear along the north edge of the property. She thought about a girl on a wooden platform in the rain who had not been able to imagine anything worth fighting for. She thought about 7 years of performed silence, the real silence inside the performed one, the years of making herself small enough not to provoke anything, which meant small enough to barely exist as herself at all. She thought about what surviving costs. Not just the immediate cost of enduring whatever needed to be endured, but the longer cost the way you keep paying for it, after the original danger has passed, the habits of smallness that outlast the situations that created them. The armor had saved her. She was not going to be ungrateful for it. It had been exactly what a 12-year-old girl needed in circumstances no child should have faced, and it had worked, and she had arrived at 20 years old alive and in possession of herself. That was not nothing. That was everything, actually. But armor is not a home. You can live in it, people do, for years, for whole lives, but it is not the same as living. It is the removal of risk, which sounds identical to safety, but is a different thing. Safety is what you have when you don't need the armor anymore. The removal of risk is what you practice when you cannot yet believe a world without armor is survivable. She lowered the rifle to her side and looked at the cabin. She could see Ronan through the window, moving in the kitchen, the shape of him doing something ordinary. She thought about the $40 pouch that had sat on the hearth for 3 days. She thought about 4 words in a rough, unused voice hitting the air of the cabin and staying there. She thought about him picking up that pouch and setting it aside, and then leading the horses back to the barn. He had not asked her to be something different from what she was. He had not offered patience in exchange for transformation. He had simply looked at her, in the way that he looked at things, with full attention and no performance, and accepted the inventory of what he found. She had given him the truth. Not gracefully, she had thrown a leather pouch on the floor and produced 4 broken words in a voice that hadn't been used in 7 years, and that was not exactly a masterwork of honest communication. But she had done it. She had taken the armor off, the final piece of it, the one that had protected her from everything including this, and the thing that happened was not what she had feared for so long. What happened was that he made coffee. She smiled at the memory of it. She turned away from the cabin and faced the open mountains and let herself stand in the spring air without cataloging exits, without assessing threats, without doing any of the work her mind had trained itself to do constantly for as long as she could remember. She just stood there. It was harder than it sounded. The habit of vigilance doesn't dissolve because you decide you're done with it. It releases slowly over time, the way tension leaves a muscle that has been held too long in stages, reluctantly, with occasional reflexive tightening before it finally lets go. She was not done with it. She would probably never be entirely done with it. But she could stand in a mountain clearing in the spring and know that what was behind her was a cabin she had earned, and a man she had chosen, and a life that was hers in a way that nothing had ever been hers before. That was enough, more than enough. That was, she thought, the whole of it. She opened her mouth, and she sang. Her voice was not what it had been when she was 12 years old and singing in her father's garden. It was rougher, lower, shaped by years of disuse and reconstruction, and the particular hoarseness that comes from emotion held too long in the throat. The song she chose was one of her father's an old working song, something she couldn't remember all the words to, and filled in with humming where the gaps were. She hit a note wrong once, adjusted without stopping, and kept going. She sang it all the way through. When it ended, she stood in the quiet that followed, and the mountains did not respond. Because mountains do not respond, and the spring air moved through the trees in its own indifferent way, and from inside the cabin she heard nothing at all. She turned toward the door. She had her hand on it when she heard from the direction of the creek, beyond the north tree line, the distance of a man who had gone to check on something, and was not trying to be heard a single short whistle. Not a signal with meaning, not an attempt to communicate anything specific. Just the sound a person makes when they have heard something and want, without making much of it, to acknowledge that they heard. She stood with her hand on the door and did not move for a moment. Then she went inside. The weeks that followed were not simple, because nothing real is simple, and she had lived long enough to be suspicious of simple. They were learning each other in a new way, not the way she had been learning him through the winter, cataloging from a careful distance, but the way two people learn each other when both of them are visible. This was harder and better, and occasionally aggravating. He had moods she hadn't fully seen before. Days when the old quiet came down over him like weather, and he moved through the cabin with a distance in his eyes that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with whatever the war had left in. Him that was still there, still requiring management. She learned to read these days early. There were small signs, the set of his shoulders in the morning, a particular quality to his silence over coffee, and she learned that the right response was not to press it against them, but to simply stay in the room and let the day pass. "You don't have to be fine," she told him once, on one of those days. He looked at her from across the table. "I know you're not," she said. "I'm not asking you to be." He was quiet for a long moment. "It passes," he said. "I know it does," she said. "I'm just saying you don't have to pretend it isn't there." He looked at her in a way that told her no one had said that to him before. Or at least not in a long time. He didn't answer, but that night he sat closer to the fire than usual, and at some point he talked not about the war specifically, not about anything she could have pinpointed, just talked, low and ongoing. The way he had talked to what he thought was empty air all winter, and she listened the way she had always listened, with her full self, and this time she didn't have to pretend she wasn't. She had her own bad days, too. Days when the weight of what she had carried for 7 years seemed to want to be felt all at once, when something ordinary, the angle of late light through a window, the sound of a door closing too hard knocked something loose inside her that she wasn't ready for. She was not graceful about these days. She was quiet in a different way from her performed quiet, the kind of quiet that was not armor but simply pain, and she was not good at letting him see it. He was patient about this in a specific way. He did not probe. He did not hover. He did what she had learned to do for him, stayed in the room, went about his work, made coffee, and let the day pass. Once, coming in from the barn to find her sitting at the table with her face doing something she couldn't stop, he set a mug in front of her and sat down across from her and said nothing at all, and somehow the nothing was exactly right. "I don't always know how to do this," she told him one evening. She meant all of it, not the cooking, or the cabin, or the mountain. The being known part. The part where someone saw you on your worst days, and you couldn't rearrange your face fast enough. "Neither do I," he said. "I think that's normal." "Is it?" "I'm not an authority," he said, "but I think so." She thought about this. "We're both figuring it out." "We are," he said. "That's not a great qualification," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it's what we've got." She looked at him across the table. He looked back at her. They were, she thought, the least qualified people imaginable for this particular endeavor, and they were in it anyway. And there was something almost funny about that, if you looked at it right. She kept learning the mountain. This was important to her in a way she hadn't expected, not just practical self-sufficiency, though that mattered enormously, but something more fundamental. She needed to know this place on her own terms, not just through Ronan's knowledge or Ronan's guidance. She needed to understand it with her own senses, her own judgment, her own capacity to read what it was telling her. She learned to read weather. He taught her over several weeks, not all at once, but in the field, standing beside her and pointing things out in real time. The particular formation of clouds that meant snow within hours. The way the wind changed direction when a front was moving in. the behavior of the animals, how they quieted or shifted before a weather event. She was a quick study. He said so without the qualifier, which she noted. She learned the trap lines. This was harder not physically, though it was physically demanding, but emotionally in ways she hadn't anticipated. There was something about understanding the mechanics of surviving in this place, the particular transaction between hunter and hunted, the careful, unglamorous work of it, that required an adjustment in herself she hadn't known she needed to make. She made it. She wasn't sentimental about it, but she wasn't cold about it either. She took it seriously, which Ronan seemed to consider the appropriate response. She went out alone for the first time in the 5th week after the revelation. Not far an hour's walk to the creek and back on a clear morning with weather she had read herself 2 days before and found to be exactly what she had predicted. She didn't tell him she was going. She just went. She came back to find him in the barn, repairing something, and he looked up when she came in and nodded once, and she nodded back. And that was the whole of it. He had not worried, or he had worried and not shown it, which was its own kind of respect. She started writing things down, not a journal, not anything organized, just words and fragments and the beginnings of things she wasn't sure the nature of yet. She filled small pieces of paper with her cramped handwriting and left them in a pile at the corner of the table. He never read them. She knew he never read them because they were right there in the open and they never moved. This was, she thought, a form of trust she hadn't expected to find and was grateful for. One evening, a warm one, the summer that was coming, beginning to assert itself in the quality of the air, she sat outside on the step of the cabin while the light went long and gold across the clearing. The mountains turned pink and then copper and then the particular bruised purple that they did in the last light, and she watched all of this with the specific attention she had developed over months. The attention that noticed things without immediately cataloging their threat potential. An old dog came and put his head on her knee. Flint, the gray-muzzled shepherd mix, who had appeared 2 winters ago and attached himself to the place, to the specific geometry of its 2 humans, in the way that animals sometimes do when they have found what they were looking for. She put her hand on his head. He was warm and heavy and unbothered by everything that had ever happened. She heard Ronan come out of the cabin behind her. He stood there for a moment. Then he sat down on the step beside her, their shoulders almost touching, and he looked at the mountains in the last light. Neither of them spoke for a while. The light changed through its stages. The dog sighed deeply. "I've been thinking about the north corner," Ronan said. She glanced at him. "The leak. I should have fixed it 2 winters ago. I kept thinking I'd get to it. We can fix it before the melt next year," she said. "We." She said it without thinking, and it landed in the air between them and stayed there. He didn't comment on it, but she felt the slight shift in the quality of his stillness, the way you feel someone absorbing a small important thing. "I'll need to get down slope timber for the patch," he said. "You could help me select it. You've got a better eye for grain than I do." "You just figured this out," she said. "I've known it for a while," he said. It seemed unnecessary to mention. She looked at him. He was looking at the mountains with the particular expression she had learned to associate with contentment, not happiness exactly, not any large declarative emotion, but the quieter thing that sits underneath large emotions in people who have learned to be careful about them. The specific peace of a man who has stopped fighting his own life. "Ronan," she said. He looked at her. She had been trying to find a way to say something for weeks. Several times she had started and stopped, deciding the words weren't right, that the moment wasn't right, that she should wait until she was sure she could say it, without it sounding like more than she meant or less than she meant. She had been treating it like a shot she needed to line up perfectly before she fired. She thought about the tin at the edge of the clearing. She thought about how she had spent 3 weeks avoiding it because she was afraid of missing, and then one afternoon she had simply breathed and fired, and it had fallen over. "I know I owe you something," she said, for the lie. "I know that. I know it wasn't." She steadied herself. "I know it cost you something to find out that the silence wasn't real." that someone had been listening to things you intended to keep private. I understand what that is. I know the shape of it. He was very still. And I'm not asking you to be fine with it, she said. I'm not asking you to say it didn't matter. It did matter. She looked at her hands. I just want you to know that everything I heard, I held it. I held all of it carefully, not because I was collecting something to use against you. Because you were the first person who ever talked to me like I was worth talking to, and I didn't want to lose a single word of it. She stopped. She was not going to cry. She had decided this. That's what I wanted to say, she said. The last light went off the mountains. The purple deepened toward dark. Somewhere in the trees, something made a sound and then was quiet. Ronan reached out and took her hand, not dramatically. Not as a grand gesture, just picked it up from where it was resting on her knee and held it in the rough warmth of his palm against hers, the way he'd held the mug on winter mornings, like it was something he intended to keep. I know, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the mountains in the dark. I know why you did it, he said. I knew before you explained it. I just needed time to sit with the fact of it. He turned his head and looked at her. I don't have any more anger about it. I want you to know that. Okay, she said. I've been thinking about what you said, he continued. About holding things carefully. He looked down at their joined hands. Nobody's done that before. With the things I carry. He said it simply, without self-pity, the way he said most true things. I don't know what to do with it entirely, but I know it matters. We'll figure it out, she said. We will, he said. The dog shifted and sighed. The mountains disappeared into the dark and became presences rather than shapes, enormous and familiar, and no longer frightening. Inside the cabin, the fire was still banked from earlier, and the lamp was lit, and everything was as it was. She thought, this is what it is to belong somewhere. Not belong as in ownership, not belong as in having nowhere else to go, and therefore here by default. Belong as in chosen actively, deliberately, with full knowledge of what you are choosing and why. She had known other places. She had survived other situations. She had made herself small enough to fit into spaces that were never designed for her and had managed those spaces with the grim competence of someone who has learned that managing is the best available option. This was not managing. This was the other thing. The thing she had not had words for when she was 13 years old, lying in the dark listening to birds through a window, understanding that the world was harsher than she had previously understood, deciding that smallness was the safest response. She had been wrong about that, not wrong that it was necessary then at that age, in that situation. It had been necessary, but wrong that it was the only thing she had ever be. Wrong to let it outlast its usefulness. Wrong to carry it all the way to a mountain and a man who had never given her a single reason to need it. The armor had been a gift she had given herself when she was 12 years old and had no other resources. She had held on to it for 7 years after it was time to put it down. That was human. That was understandable. That was, she thought, what almost everyone did with the things they built to survive, held on past the point of necessity, because letting go felt like risking the survival all over again. She had finally put it down and she had not died. Ronan was still holding her hand. The night was full around them. The mountain settled into its enormous silence, the dog dreaming at their feet. We should go in, he said eventually, temperatures dropping. In a minute, she said. He stayed. She knew he would. She sat on the step of the cabin in the mountain dark and thought about her father's garden in summer, and the smell of tomato plants, and the way he had shown her how to know if the soil was right by how it felt between two fingers. She thought about the girl on the platform in the rain who had not known that 5 months later she would be sitting here, on this mountain, in this particular darkness, holding this particular hand. She thought about how strange and improbable and ordinary it all was. How survival, if you were lucky, eventually stopped being the whole point. How the tools you built to get through one part of your life were not necessarily the right tools for the next part. How the voice you lost could come back, rough and different, and yours. She opened her mouth. She sang the same song she had sung in the clearing, her father's work song, the one with the gaps she filled with humming. And she sang it into the mountain dark with Ronan's hand in hers and the dog at her feet, not for any audience, not to prove anything, not as reclamation or triumph or statement, just because the song was there in her and the night was the right kind of quiet to put it into. She sang it all the way through. When it ended, Ronan said nothing. He squeezed her hand once lightly, the small particular pressure of someone who doesn't have words for something and is not going to reach for inadequate ones. She squeezed back. They sat a little longer in the dark, and then they went inside. And the cabin held them the way it had held the winter and the wind and the illness and the ordinary days, and all accumulated into something neither of them had planned, but both of them had separately and then together chosen. The lamp was lit. The fire needed building. The dog went to his place by the hearth and circled twice and lay down. She built the fire. He put the coffee on. Outside, the mountain sat in its ancient patient dark, holding the cold and the stars and the creek running north through the tree line, indifferent to the small cabin at its foot, indifferent to the two people inside it and what they had made of the improbable intersection of their lives. But inside the cabin, it was warm, and Mara Vane, who had been silent for 7 years and had found her voice in the last place she had expected to find it, sat down at the table and picked up her pencil and wrote on a small piece of paper, "The armor kept me alive long enough to learn I didn't need it." She looked at it. She left it on the table. He would not read it. She knew he would not read it, but it was there, in the open air of the place they had made together, no longer something she had to carry alone. That was enough. That was she had learned exactly enough. This story is a work of fiction created entirely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, and events are fictional.